This is our last session for today, and it's a roundtable. I don't know if you can see the circle in here, but we imagine that you're all in this circle. I'm really thrilled to be here and talk to these two wonderful scholars whom I read and admire. So I feel super privileged to be here. No pressure. I have very many questions, and many of them were addressed during previous presentations, even today when we talked about community archives. But I still have many very pressing questions for me, and I would really like to hear your opinion and your perspective on them, because both of you have worked in archives and with archives for many, many years. But you come from very different backgrounds. You come with different training. You ask different research questions, and I'm really curious to hear both, and so we can see how much different we are and how similar we are. So I hope if we have time in the end, I can't promise, but if we have and run through questions real fast, then we would invite you to ask questions as well. But if you don't like any of the questions, you can just ignore them and talk about something you
don't
want
give
to talk
Anne that
about.
option.
No? Oh, she will use it. All right. So my first question is, and you talked a little bit about this yesterday, but I would like to hear what you think. What is the role of folklore archives as institutions and university and research institution archives in archival multiverse?
I'll start with that. I suppose, first of all, just to say I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be a part of these conversations. And I really think this is where we wanted to be when we were looking to the ICA and to expand the conversations. I think we started to see how archives were growing and developing and changing. And I think it was really important that as folklorists, we saw we've been doing a lot of that for a long time, and we didn't want to be left out of the conversation. So that's kind of a bigger thing. But I suppose I come from a very conservative, in terms of folkloristics, archives or working with archives have become a very conservative area, or perceived conservative area within folkloristics. So again, CF, the organization that we're a part of from the folklore side, archives would have been core to when that was an organization 100 years ago, to all the members that would have been a part of it. But as time went on, we as folklorists have always had this kind of love affair, love-hate relationship with archives, and so many of the people in the audience here will be familiar with Larry Hunko and his work of loving the archive, not loving the archive, all these. So we ourselves have gone through so much with it. But I suppose, again, being a student here, at the time when I was a student, you were just entrenched in the art. You never left the archive. The archive is where your training was. Your archive was where the lectures happened. You were just surrounded by it. And you were given, in a very historical sense, an understanding of how this archive came about and the various leading figures who brought this archive about. So in a way, and Christor in the audience will, until he was director, of course, he was an archivist/collector. That was the job title here in UCD when the commission, when the Irish Folklore Commission was folded up and it was made into the department here in the university, they created this kind of archivist/collector. So that's who I met. That was like a job title, and that's how you kind of saw yourself as well. And it is a really interesting thing to think about it, that was a really, and now that I see it, it was a really unique kind of training thing. And again, since I've referred to Larry Hunko, my favorite joke by Larry is, we as folklorists, we collect our ethnographic material and we put it in the archive to share with everyone, to draw on our fabulous research. Sociologists, they go out, they collect the same material, but once they do up their data, they destroy the field work, right? And then anthropologists, when they go out and collect their material, well, they keep it to themselves because no one else will understand it as well as they do. So we always, even like within our kind of cognate fields, the archive was something very special to us in that way. I don't know if you want to... Your thoughts on folklore archives, Anne?
I will say, I think when I started out on my career, this conversation wouldn't have happened, right? So I was trained as a records person. So for me, records first and foremost are about accountability and transparency and those things that I personally think are incredibly important and becoming more important in life. And archivists did not collect, right? And when you work in the United States, where if you're in a university context, libraries, special collections, and university archives get all conflated. And I was a university archivist, so they were always the poor relation in all of this as well. But all sorts of things have changed in the last 30 years. And inside the archival profession has become really reflexive and critical. It has its own really major internal debates about, what that word archive means, what the term records means, and it's expanded enormously. And in that 30 years, I've also worked all over the world, and I've seen everything, all sorts of things. And I think with folklore archives, I'm on the board of UCLA's Folklore Archive, which has now been rebranded as the Archive of Healing. And we have a really interesting range of board members now at UCLA. And I got involved with our folklore archives because when I first started working at UCLA, they had an NEH grant, National Endowment for the Humanities, and I was asked to help them with the indexing of an Irish medicinal collection. And I wrote recently to the new curator of the archive, and I said, this is so interesting because that collection was my childhood. And I was absolutely astonished it's in a folklore archive, because to me, that was the knowledge I grew up with. Or I grew up on a farm in the northwest of Ireland, and when we had bee stings or sick stomachs or whatever, this was our go-to. And I think just spending 2 days here listening to everyone has made me have to sort of reshuffle my own thoughts again about, I was sitting here thinking, so where do folklore archives stop and community archives start? Right? I was really, really interested with the last incredibly articulate session, and I'm thinking I can't articulate in any way like our last 3 speakers could do it. And I also thought, because I was saying to a few people, I come from the part of the world that the mumming presentation yesterday, so that's my part of the world. And again, and there, my family spoke Ulster Scots, not Irish, not English. And it's interesting to see yourself suddenly put in an archive as kind of an exhibit. Sorry, that sounds really rude, right? But and what I'm thinking here, because I know I'm familiar with the schools collection in particular, and that was my father's generation, and my understanding with that was part of that, the aspiration was to build a new history of Ireland, not a British history of Ireland, but an Irish history of Ireland that was from, the people and the land up. And as such, I don't see it. I see it more like what I would consider to be a real archive than a folklore archive because of that. And the fact that a lot of that was collected through the eyes of children, even in a highly scaffolded way, makes it even more interesting, and more interesting archivally too. So.
Thank you both. I wish we had more time to step back, even more back, and talk about such fundamental, about terminology. Vladka mentioned that we use in the audience, in this audience, because we have people from so many different backgrounds, we use terms differently, we understand them differently. So I wish we had time to talk about how do you understand archives, and how do you understand tradition, and what is folklore? Because I'm sure that people who work exclusively in university archives, they may not understand folklore as you do, for example, Kelly. And as important it is to talk about evidentiality and accountability and those very significant concepts for records management and archives that folklore archivists may not think necessarily about. So I think there's more for us to discuss, but let's move on with our next question, and it ties into the previous session, communities specifically. Folklorists have worked with communities for many years in their own way, in very specific way. And you have so much experience working with diverse communities as well. So I'm just wondering, I would like you to share your perspectives on the role of an institution in this work with communities. And whoever wants to start.
Yeah, that's again very interesting. And I suppose when you're talking here, I'm not to be overly binary, but to even begin the conversation, I would have been very aware that our archive was from a very grassroots perspective. That again, to be an informant in our archive, and it wasn't that you were a power player or you were this amazing politician. Again, it was that very vernacular grassroots perspective. And it was giving a perspective. And I would say, when I speak to my students, I say, if you can't imagine this being in an archive like a state archive, well, then we need to collect it. That sense. And so I did see that kind of, if you do see state archives having that more top-down official records, again, let's be very kind of put the spectrums here. So again, Chris talking about the community and things are really coming together in a way like it's all melding. But from my perspective, I came at it, and my Chicago accent is coming through very strongly here. I come from a very strong trade unionist family in Chicago. I came with that really North American way of it, and I really gelled. But then when you here in Ireland, it doesn't necessarily have that impact with it. But so from that perspective, and with my students, that's where I want to get them started. And now that those lines are blurring, and again, an officialdom and versus non-officialdom and the community. But I do think it's really important we can't be, again, I have this image, Tom Munnelly, one of the famous folk song collectors of Ireland, and who I was really privileged to be trained by, he has this image of, like we're like a bulldozer pulling up daisies, just trying to collect what we can. And in that sense, the appraisal for us when we were talking earlier is if you're a folklorist collector, you're constantly having to have this appraisal space in who you're collecting from, who you're engaging with in that way. And it is that sense, I think, institutions are trying that represent, that you can't include every single individual, but are communities being represented? Are they seeing themselves? And as Christor was speaking of some of the projects he's been working with recently for the National Folklore Collection, that kind of different side, the Protestant voices, the voices that Anne felt were excluded in, perhaps if I not to project too much here, but that's,
mystified maybe.
Mystified, and again, that sense. And now, but when you look at the collection though, some of the earliest material we have are late 18th century small songbooks that are coming from the Protestant community. So when you really look into the collections, there are, again, that kind of hidden voice maybe be seen there. But it is that sense, because it's who do you come to? I suppose my work now is very much Dublin based, and working with various social housing communities in Dublin, or the Ivy markets, the Dublin fruit and veg market, so that kind of area. But again, that's me as one individual working with numerous communities, trying to see what we can do.
I think one of the hallmarks of archives, as traditionally thought of, is that archives work for their own entities, right? So archives serve themselves, their own institutions first. And if we project that through to something like community archives have to serve the community first. And one of the big distinctions, of course, that is made by community archives folks is it has to be by them, not about them, right? And that is a huge distinction. And I think, the Aaron project was fabulous, absolutely fabulous project. I thought the Cork project also. These are absolutely, and also Aberdeen. These are wonderful, and that's I think something like the Aberdeen project shows where more mainstream institutions may interface, and I think it was Nicholas who said that maybe one of the end roles is that you may be the repository of last resort, right? Because often community archives get distressed at some point, they run out of resources, but first the community, and then maybe it may eventually have to be that the safety net are the bigger institutions. But when I was doing the presentation yesterday, I was talking about participatory approaches. A keynote to participation, I think, from the perspective of those of us who work in universities, is humility and recognizing that our interests cannot trump everybody else's interests, and our expertise is not paramount. In fact, it may not be even appropriate in certain settings, and to listen more than speak, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Could I just add something? I just want to say, and again, how organizations can change over time, because if you look at the Irish Folklore Commission, the Traveller questionnaire, which would have been referred to as the Tinker questionnaire in the 1950s, again, that's people writing about travellers. It's not coming from the travelling community. And I cannot see the collection carrying out an activity to that way now. That would not be, so in a way, it's kind of important to see those changes that have happened. So in that regard of how you're referring to the community archives, we can see how folklore archives would be very much in keeping with that, but that may not be how we were necessarily in the past. I mean, in the past, at least we felt they needed to be represented. How they were being represented could be different. And that'd be similar, again, if you think of the emigration questionnaire of the 1950s. Again, it's people talking about the returned Yanks. It's not the returned Yanks themselves talking about their experience. So again, it's very constantly changing.
Can I just add one more thing to that? Because I also listening to the speakers yesterday talking about the sort of computational analysis of folklore archives, I think leagues ahead of where other archives are at the moment, in a very important space that people need to go into. Not because computational analysis can give you all the texture that you need and emotional, affective aspects, but it can do some things that are really important. If you get it right, you can surface lost knowledge, you can surface places of silence, you can start to understand why those are there, you can see patterns that may lead you to be able to do some other things archivally to remedy what you're seeing or to build on what you're seeing. And I think that work is incredibly important at that granular level, because that granular level is rarely done in more mainstream archives too. And that is a direction that we could learn so much from this kind of work.
Yeah, and I suppose just to add to that, it's like their findings won't be the end-all be-all of that material, but it just gives us another perspective, another lens to look through it. And I think that, and then it allows us, because I think sometimes it can be, archives can be quite overwhelming. Like, where do you begin? Where do you even start? I know so many colleagues their exhaustive studies of what have you, after so many years, they're still working on it, because how do you feel you've done it? There's just so much material. So I'm really interested in seeing that granularity and what it does say. I'm looking forward to arguing against it as well, and giving other perspectives to it as well. But it is, I just feel AI is another chance. I know, of course, it can be very frightening and other ways it can be utilized, but it's our next kind of excitement in terms of how we can engage as being human beings and to look at what it is to be human.
Can't ignore it exists, it's around.
No.
I think, archives that we wouldn't necessarily collect the way we did it in the past for all sorts of ethical reasons. We do have the ability, however, because they were collected, to be able to uncover certain things that we couldn't have done otherwise. And I have to think through what the ethics of that are, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of it. So.
That was exactly my hope, that they can't stop talking and reflecting to each other, so it worked. This reminds me a lot about yesterday, some of the yesterday conversation, and how much, for me personally, it came through from Folklore Archivist, emphasis on collection on one end and dissemination on the other end of this whole process, while for professional archivists, it's, well, the archival functions when you have acquisition, appraisal, arrangement and description, preservation and access. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it kind of reflects what you were just saying. And I also wanted to mention one of the things that you, Kelly, noted, this blurriness of between different types of archives. And I think this is so true because in the past, yes, it was white important dudes, right, in archives. Well, we all know this is not my invention. While folklorists were always interested in, I don't want to say underdog, but that was also the term that was used at some point in time, but unrepresented or underrepresented communities. So this is really blurring, and this reflexivity that I would like to think that folklore archivists have developed quite a while ago, and ability to listen, ability to center the person that you're listening to, identifying the speaker as the creator of record rather than me as a recorder of that interview. I think these are super important things that folklore archivists could share. Where am I leading with this? I'm not really sure. But anyway, I have another, a little provocation. Yesterday, I think Karen mentioned that records are usually dead in archives. And from a professional archivist perspective, records really are deposited into archival institutions when they're no longer used, when they're no longer needed for everyday operations or activities. I think I noticed that some folklore archivists flinched a little bit to that notion. Because folklore archives try to document and collect living traditions. So I would like you both to speak a little bit about that difference and how you understand each other doing the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Well, again, when we say folklore archives, again, it's really folklore documentation. So in that regard, you could see it as a not a dead record, but it is a recording of a telling of a performance that happened at a very specific time, at a very specific place, by a very specific individual. And that moment in time will never happen again, but it has been documented. So in that regard, you could, again, we don't have folklore archives, we just have documentation of folklore is what we have. So in that, I can see it. And another way, it is that sense of seeing it, that performance element of it, and it's almost trying to, that art, I would see as something really important in terms of folkloristic archival literacy, is being able to see a video or a photograph or a text-based piece from an archive and be able to think about the live performance in which this comes from. So there's almost this kind of, you have to this value-added skill that you need to remember has happened. So I take it as that. But then in other regards, of course, There is much, and I think sometimes people think because it's in the Folklore Archive that it is still living, that this is representative of something that is happening now, still, as if almost like a novel, you know, like I was always impressed as a child when someone said, like, novels are present tense, like whenever you open it, that character is still doing that same thing. I was so fascinated by that concept as a child. Like, it was almost like, open the book, are they still doing it? Like the fridge light. And it is that sense of kind of capturing it, but then hoping, again, in that term of archival literacy, just because it has been archived at one point in time does not mean that this is the way it is currently in life, even though it may feel like it, because it has such a vibrant documentation record of it.
I heard that comment yesterday about, you know, archives having dead stuff in it. And it immediately reminded me, I went to something at some point at the Getty in Los Angeles, and they were talking about archiving performance art, you know, and that they kill it in order to preserve it, you know, and it always resonates with me because I believe archives are living. And somebody mentioned Sue McCamish, who's a great friend of mine, and we've collaborated for years together, but you know, that whole notion of the records continuum I'm a big fan of, and the idea that archivists don't just live in the past, they live in the present, and they're working toward the future, you know, that you're constantly moving between those different modalities. And so appraisal, and Brad mentioned appraisal earlier, archivists are proactively engaged in appraisal, and they're thinking about, you know, what the record of the future needs to be as well. So you're not collecting dead stuff. You are actually helping society in a sort of proactive way. And I actually think that there's a big point of crossover between traditional archives and community archives, at least traditional archives in a records continuum sense, and the work that community archives do, which, you know, if you go back to Andrew Flynn, and we had, you know, some really nice quotes from Andrew earlier, you know, he talks about, you know, putting history into action, and that is a big part of the sort of political agenda associated with, certainly with, as was pointed out earlier, with US ideas about community archives. So.
Thank you. I'm always fascinated how the phrase traditional archives is used, because every second person in this audience, well, folklore archivists would think that folklore archives are traditional archives. And professional archivists would think that, well, those real archives are traditional archives. So it just always fascinates me how
it's only used that term for the last 15 years. When community archives came along, we had to have a way to differentiate that from...
That's right. And what do you use?
Mainstream archives.
Conventional, mainstream, none of them is good enough.
No.
Yeah, I agree. And for what you were saying, Kelly, I often use the definition offered by World Intellectual Property Organization. They talk about traditional knowledge, but also traditional cultural expressions. So I guess when folklore archives document try to document tradition, in fact, they capture those expressions in a particular context, by a particular individual performed in this weather, in this, you know, physical condition, and all of this kind of stuff. So, yes. My next question is slightly more theoretical, I guess. In archival science, record is one of the fundamental concepts. In folklore archives, and now I was trained as a folklorist and then as an information professional, so I think I'm identifying more and more as an archivist than a folklore archivist in any way, due to my daily job, but also how my thinking is moving. But as far as I understand, tradition is as fundamental concept for folklore archives and folklore archivists. Professionally, we are trained to ask different questions when we work with archival materials. And how do you think this manifests or impacts archival practice that we do?
Maybe. So I think earlier various people said, we're in the middle of a lot of terms that have become very slippery because they're used in many, many different contexts. And archives is a really good example of that. But record has become, and record is also record, right? So depending on whether it's a noun or a verb, has become one of those terms. And again, I think in the last 20 years, the community archives movement has really broadened notions of the record. So have, sort of ethical movements to pluralize, to diversify. And so we realize that, the record, whatever that means, of a community, of a culture, is expressed in many, many different forms. And archives have to be much more conscious of the fact that, they're not just words on paper all the time, or even words on tape, right? Or recording devices. And we have to be cognizant of that. But at the same time, I know there are people in this room who have to work with legal definitions of records. And they are circumscribed by those definitions. The US National Archives is an example of that. And we have to be careful that when we use any of these terms, that we define the context within which we're using them. Otherwise, we just confuse everybody, and we probably set ourselves up for arguments that are not actually helpful arguments to have. So.
Yeah, no, I suppose, and again, I think it's really interesting that coming more from the folklore side of things, of thinking of archives, I don't really get too caught up on spending time thinking about what the record is. I guess I get caught up on the material. I want it to be findable. I want it to be, again, like any archivist, if it's in the archive and you can't find it, what's the point of having it? And in particular, it kind of comes back to refer back earlier to that question of the institution and the communities. Again, being trained as a folklore archivist, I was trained very early on that those who contributed the material were our number one kind of audience or concern. And if there was someone that had, at some time had contributed to the commission or what have you, they were just held in the highest regard, as you can only imagine, as they should be. And that in the anniversary of the schools collection, even before it was on Dukas, that sense and importance of anyone who had contributed to the schools collection was treated and still is treated so well when they come in. So I think that folklore side of things, that sense of the community in which the material comes from. Now, again, you could arguably, when you look at records from the 1940s and 50s, perhaps I have a much more empathy that may or may not have been there, but it is demonstrated in the material that was collected there. So, but I find it really, I will be lying in bed tonight going, what do I mean by the record? But for me, I use it more as...
You don't have to do that.
I use the word record as much as, again, there isn't, something kind of things you throw out at your students, like there isn't anything you couldn't make a folklore project out of. There isn't anything you couldn't make an oral history project out of. Like, again, I would argue, from a folklore point of view, it is what perspective are you coming from? Where are you entering into this world and how you document it? I would still feel very strongly about that.
I think, and you're right, we have successfully confused everyone, and ourselves including.
Our tech folks will be thinking about records as something completely
a totally different world.
Too.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Having heard you speaking about these respective contexts, I would like to know what I'm personally very much interested in potential that comes out from this collaboration, from having you two sitting next to each other and talking to each other. How much interaction, I think you answered this already, how much interaction there is now between university or research institution archives and folklore archives, but also what benefits do you see, if you see any, they could bring to each other, bring to the table and share if there is interest, because you can't make anyone being interested, right?
Yeah.
Well, I would just say, I mean, like I said, with the like the computational analysis and linguistic analysis, I think is really, really interesting. It is, you know, there are techniques that could be not the same, but that could be models that could be pulled out and used in lots of other contexts, I think, that are more, now I can't use the word, mainstream archival context. And one of the reasons I say that is because there's the most enormous sort of digital deluge coming at mainstream archives, and they cannot possibly physically, manually process that material. And these are, whether we like them or not, they're going to be the techniques we're going to have to use to get, you know, Brad asked a question about appraisal earlier. They're going to be the ways that we get our first impressions of what we've got and make decisions about where we deploy human analysis. But we're going to have to use these technologies, these technological approaches first to get a sense of what we've got, and then to prioritize human labor after that, I think.
Yeah. My head is kind of spinning. I could go all sorts of directions here. A few things. Again, with the kind of digital transformation, people will be coming across material and, you know, people are using Dukas and they're not necessarily saying, oh, I want to look at a folklore archive, but look at what is in here. You know, they won't. Part of that I find difficult because I want that archival literacy. With how do we kind of maintain or communicate that archival literacy in this digital age when you know the context is so much more difficult, or so that's one side of things looking at it. That I think what's helping blur it is that repositories from various ways and means are coming together. You know, the digital is almost bringing them to the same level. You know, it's interesting if you find something on Dukas and you find something from the National Archives here in Ireland. You know, as someone who has just come across it, you may not create that traditional hierarchy that may have been there before, and that's amazing and a wonderful way to start to look at material or allow material to be seen. But then, and so I just think it's really important for us more now than ever that the material is out there, that there are ways in which we, as someone had a slide, that kind of bridge between these repositories and how they are being used or how they're being explored and examined. But then a separate spread where my head went at that moment is, again, folklorists have been very keen on even ethnography on the internet. Like, how is that going to be collected in a way that we can understand it, that it is given a context, that, you know, it isn't just this big mess that's there forevermore, and you really don't have any understanding of why this kind of, you know, communicative, expressive way was kind of there at a certain point in time, and then it just kind of disappears. And so there's so much from an ethnographic point of view as folklorists that we really need to really be working in the quote unquote field, wherever that may be, is still really important.
I think the ethnographic modality is one of the meeting points now. And I know, thinking about all the doctoral students I have supervised over the years, that the majority of them have been using ethnography as a method, and that would never have happened 30 years ago. And I know my colleague Vlatka Lemic is in the room here from Croatia, but I also supervised her colleague Tamar Štefanac at the University of Zadar, and she did the first ethnographic dissertation done in Croatia. And not just in archives. And there was a lot of explanation that had to be done. You know, it wasn't ethnology, it was ethnography that had to be done to persuade the university this was even a valid approach. But But it is actually almost, it's very, very difficult to do research as an archival scholar now without actually doing that ethnographic work and really trying to understand also, here's another slippery word, context, what we mean by context, that we ourselves have to learn so much more about the spaces that we're working in. So.
Context could be a topic for another hour of us talking, because for folklorists, contextuality is paramount, and for archivists, obviously, societal provenance and all of this, it's just such an interesting topic. I keep thinking we have to probably wrap up, so I would like to, not to summarize, but to remind us that when, back in 2013, when the Folklore working group on archives of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore was conceived, I guess it was created later that year. Lauri Harvilati, who was leading this process, he saw and with support of others this need to be included into the wider archival world. And that's why ICA was approached, and the initial request was to create a separate section on tradition archives that was declined very politely. And then we were recommended to address the section on university and research institution archives. And I got involved in SUV since 2016, I think that's when I started. And talking to my colleagues, I realized that just very little time ago, we university archivists were trying to prove that we are real archives. Because ICA was all national archives. And they were looking down at what is called manuscripts in the States, right, or some other approaches. So it's very interesting to me, but you, Kelly, do you still think it's important for folklore archivists to be included? And why do you think it's important? And do you care for a folklore archivist to be, sorry for a blunt question.
I care for all archivists.
And just to finish this all, whoever was present in Riga in 2017 at the SUV conference, it was on tradition archives. And it was organized by SUV. And Chris Hurley, whom archivists in the audience probably know, he invented parallel provenance. He came up with this concept, and he's known as the description guy. He has a blog, thedescriptionguy.com, I believe. He was present very quietly in the room, watching everything happening. And then when he was asked to reflect on what he's observed in those 3 days of the conference, one of the things he said was addressed to folklore archivists. And he said, just stop proving anything. Stop proving that you're a real archivist. Just sit at the cool kids' table. Claim your space. And if someone wants to be excluding you, that's going to be their problem. They will be excluding themselves. So I keep thinking since 2017 about this phrase, and I think it's very powerful. I don't think that anyone should apologize or try to defensively explain that, oh, I'm a real archivist, actually, if I work in folk archives. But I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I didn't mention, I mean, the whole notion of the archival turn, the critical archival turn has put that word archives in a lot of different spaces. And I think it is actually important to be able to define what is different that archival professionals do from what is being done academically through theorizing, that it's not always, that they don't necessarily line up. And my colleague Michelle Caswell's written a very good piece about this, right? So I'm not going to, she can articulate that far better than I can. But I do think that that is important. But at the same time, I think, the bigger family and the bigger tent is fantastic. When I started out in this field, archivists were very lowly entities, no matter who they worked for. And university archivists, obviously, still trying to prove themselves, not so much in the States. And that's not the case any longer. I mean, I travel to a lot of countries, and immigration agents stop you and they say, what are you here for? And I say, I work with archives, and I know all about archives, and my family, and you hear all of this stuff, and this is fantastic. This is really great. There was a point when my children thought that everyone in the whole world were archivists because it was the only people they met. So
may I respond to what Anne said first?
Yeah.
I use that piece, the archive is not an archives, all the time. Whenever I'm currently doing my doctoral degree on the side when I'm not busy with all the other work and family responsibilities. But our information studies school doesn't have a doctoral program, so I have to be my home has to be in a different department that has an established program, and it's the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies. So archival turn is their thing. Foucault and Derrida is their thing, obviously. So whenever I would submit any piece of writing anonymously for some kind of feedback, they would correct my language, and I would insist on using an archives as the full plural. And they would correct me and then write on margins, well, this paper would benefit from peer review. And I'm like, this paper has gone through multiple grant applications, successful grant applications. You guys don't know what you're talking about. I couldn't say it, of course, in their face. But I kept insisting on this and archives as a form just to show the value, and there's meaning. And I got really offended when someone would come and say, oh, yeah, Maryna and all the other archivists. And I put years of thought and training and work in becoming an archivist, and I value this very much. So I do understand that it has to be, not everyone is an archivist, really. Yeah, I just wanted, I guess, to share this. I think I will care less now. It can be an archive, it could be the archive, whatever. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Archival turn, as we know it, and of course, everyone is now building archives, and I even have a list of verbs that many scholars use what they do with archives. And it's, of course, reading the archive, it's interpreting the archive, it's all these, some are really interesting sounding. But folklore archives actually have existed since, well, 19th century, so it's not really a new tradition. So I keep thinking that they're slightly different than these postmodern archival projects rather than archives, and this is why I insist that folklore archives are institutions. They are institutions. They're not just a project or someone
individual.
Creating. So thank you.
But sorry, to go back to Maryna, I suppose when Laurie came to speak to us and said, I think it's really important we become we're recognized as the ICA. I think that was. We felt, whenever we come together, as international colleagues, I think we were feeling the pressure that our resources as tradition archives were getting, I think it was to almost become a part of a larger network because we were feeling we were becoming smaller in that way, and it was to find support as part of it. And then secondly, I didn't realize that I would have been seen differently as I think we were like, the folklore archive here is like here, we're if anyone told me I wasn't an archivist because I learned how to be an archivist in folklore, I would have ignored them. So, but it was really interesting. And then it comes back, I became a member of ICA then, and I didn't really think I just did it to be supportive, and that this is as a movement we had decided that this organization was important for us, and then I didn't really think I was going to get much from it, and then the reading group and various things, I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, and when Anne and I were just externs or examiners on a PhD. When I met Anne, I was like, oh my God, archivists can be amazing that aren't folklore archivists.
That's a compliment.
Wow. So I think it's really interesting. As a you asked what is folklore. I mean, we're constantly, what is it? These terms, even within our own fields, we're always negotiating and seeing them as being very malleable. And once terms become dead, then they're not living anymore. So as you bring others into the conversation, I suppose it is that way to try and show how you're dancing together, or what perspectives are you coming from, and the importance of that, you know. And I think university archives, you know, some are, you know, some people here may be working with only records that the university itself makes, and I think that's interesting to think about. But when our archive, being the Irish Folklore Commission, before it was a part of a university, and it becoming a part of a university was a big kind of conversation at the time in the late 1960s into the 70s. Like, is this, you know, is UCD the place that this should actually be housed, and what is it? And, you know, this kind of sense that UCD is the custodian of this archive, but it doesn't own this archive, and things, you know, so.
Who does?
Who does, exactly. So again, it's just a really interesting space to be in, and to have these conversations, and to see perspectives, and to know Anne is supporting a folklore archive in UCLA, and it's fantastic.
Well, I think on this metaphor of dancing, I think we will wrap up. I hope we continue dancing with these ideas and thoughts and discussions, and I'm really proud to be part of SUV, and that SUV created the space for such conversations to happen. I hope we'll have more of those in the future. I hope it was interesting.